Story number 1. The Stranger in the Night at Pilgrim Mine. I'm not one to believe in ghosts, at least not when it comes to places like Pilgrim Mine. I've seen too much, worked too hard to give in to the stories of spirits wandering the tunnels or the curses that some claim haunt these places. But after what happened to me, after what I saw, I'm not sure what to believe anymore. I used to think there were logical explanations for everything. But the night I met the stranger in the mine, all that certainty vanished. Let me start from the beginning. My name's Derek Calloway. I've been a miner for nearly 10 years. Ever since I was a teenager. Pilgrim Mine wasn't the first place I worked, but it's where I ended up after bouncing around a few other jobs. You hear the stories before you get to a place like that about the bad accidents, the men who never came back from the depths. But like I said, I didn't believe in ghosts or curses. I believed in hard work and paychecks, in the sound of a pickaxe against rock, the rattle of the conveyor belts, the buzz of lights above the tunnels. Pilgrim is an old mine, one of those places that's seen its share of life and death. The equipment is outdated, the air is thick with dust, and there's a constant hum in the background, a reminder that the earth is never truly still. The deeper you go, the colder it gets. The deeper you go, the more the walls feel like they're closing in. But that's the life of a miner, isn't it? You go down, you dig, and you do your job. I was working a late shift that night. Nothing unusual. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, mocking my fatigue as I hammered away at the stone, my pickaxe biting into the earth. The air was damp, the usual stench of sulfur and coal dust filling my lungs with each breath. The light from my headlamp flickered occasionally, casting long, grotesque shadows on the tunnel walls. I don't know how long I'd been down there, working by myself. The hours tend to blend together when you're in a place like Pilgrim Mine. But then, something happened that stopped me in my tracks. I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the echo of my own boots, or maybe the sound of someone else coming down the tunnel. But the footsteps were too rhythmic, too deliberate. I looked around, and that's when I saw him, a man, standing a few yards away in the shadows. He was wearing the same worn miner's gear that I had seen hundreds of times. A faded jacket, dirty overalls, the thick boots that made a dull thud as he moved. He had a helmet on, but I couldn't see his face. There was something odd about him, something off. It was as if he was waiting, as if he were standing there, just beyond the light, watching me. "Hey!" I called out, my voice rough from hours of working in the dry air. "You lost or something?" There was no answer. The man just stood there, motionless, as if he hadn't heard me. The silence between us stretched long and taut, like a wire pulled tight enough to snap. I stepped closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The man didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in the shadows. My heart was starting to pound in my chest, but I shook it off. It had to be another miner, someone I hadn't met yet, someone who'd gotten in late. Maybe. "Hey!" I shouted again, my voice rising in irritation. "You hear me?" Still no answer. I took another step forward, a little more cautiously this time. Something in the back of my mind was telling me that something wasn't right. There was a weight to the air around me now, something oppressive that hadn't been there before. The flickering light from my helmet cast strange angles, and the shadows seemed to stretch out longer, darker, like the very mine itself was alive and hungry. I took one more step, just enough to bring me close enough to reach out and tap the man on the shoulder. But when I got there, when I finally got close enough to touch him, he was gone, vanished, just like that. There was no sound, no shift in the air. One moment he was there, and the next, nothing. I stood frozen for a moment, my pulse racing, my breath coming in short gasps. I spun around, checking the shadows, the walls, the tunnel entrance. But there was no one, no sign of him, nothing but the silence and the faint hum of the mine's machinery. I turned back toward the exit, my footsteps louder now, echoing in the stillness. My head was spinning, my mind racing. I'd seen something, I knew it. But what? Who was that man? I had to be hallucinating. There was no other explanation. Maybe the exhaustion was getting to me. Maybe I'd been down there too long, too far from the light of the surface. But as I reached the lift that would take me up to the surface, something caught my eye. It was a helmet, lying on the ground at the edge of the tunnel. It was old, worn, and covered in dust, just like the one the man had been wearing. I bent down, my fingers brushing the metal. Felt cold, too cold. I looked at the nameplate, worn and scratched, but still legible. The name was barely visible, but it was there. Jonas Carter. I froze. Jonas Carter was the name of a miner who had died in a cave-in here at Pilgrim Mine over 25 years ago. He had been working late one night, just like I had, when the roof had given way. His body had never been recovered. The rescue teams had spent days searching the tunnels, but they found nothing. The official report said that Jonas had simply been swallowed by the mine, that his body was lost to the depths. And yet, there it was, his helmet, the same helmet I had just seen on the stranger. I don't remember much after that. The panic set in. I ran. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, up the steep incline to the surface, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt colder the higher I went, the silence pressing down on me like a heavy weight. When I finally made it to the top, I didn't stop running. I didn't even stop to catch my breath. I just kept going, out into the open, into the daylight. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not at first. Who would believe me? What could I say? That I had seen a dead man walking? That I had met the ghost of a miner lost long ago? No, I kept it to myself. But the doubt never left me. The question, the thing that gnawed at me, was always there. Had I seen something that night? Or had I just gone mad from the isolation and the work? But then, a few months later, a young miner named Paul came to me. He had just started at Pilgrim and was working the night shift. He pulled me aside one day, his face pale, eyes wide. He told me he'd seen something too, something just like what I had seen. A man in the shadows. A figure in the mine who vanished before he could get close enough to speak. It was then I knew. I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't alone. Pilgrim Mine isn't just a place of work. It's a place where the past lingers, where the dead sometimes walk among the living, and where the shadows hold secrets that can never be uncovered. And as for Jonas Carter, well, I don't know if he ever left, but I'm not going back to find out. Story number 2. The Curse of Eska Mine. The first time I heard about Eska Mine, I was just a boy, barely old enough to understand the weight of the words. My father, a man of few but heavy words, had told me stories about it. He would sit by the fireplace at night, the dim light flickering in his eyes, and he'd speak of the accidents that happened there, of the miners who had perished, their lives claimed by 1,000 tons of coal and stone. But that wasn't what frightened me most. No, it was the silence in his voice when he spoke of it, as though the very mention of Eska was enough to call something from the depths. Eska Mine sat in the remote hills of Alaska, surrounded by nothing but snow, jagged cliffs, and the kind of cold that can freeze a man's soul. By the time I came into the world, the mine had already been abandoned, left to rot like so many forgotten places, but the stories lingered, like a shadow that never quite left. In the 1920s, Eska was a bustling mine, thriving off the coal that fueled the industry. But then, one day in 1924, everything changed. A terrible explosion rocked the entire mine, collapsing tunnels, burying dozens of men alive. The official records say that 37 men died that day. But the rumors, well, the rumors said it was more, much more. Some said the earth itself had swallowed the souls of the miners, dragging them into the dark and leaving them there to wander for eternity. There was one survivor, a man by the name of Robert Clark, who had been working in the lower levels when the explosion happened. He was pulled out of the rubble with a broken leg and a mangled arm. But his mind had broken too. He lived for a while after the accident, but no one could get a straight answer from him. He only muttered things about voices, and shadows, and a deep, echoing scream that still haunted him. It wasn't until years later, in the late 1940s, that the mine became something of an urban legend. It was abandoned, but there were still those who ventured out there, thrill-seekers, curious souls, even some fools looking to make a quick buck off the forgotten coal that might still be hidden deep inside. They never came back, or if they did, they came back broken, their faces pale, eyes wild, muttering nonsense about things they saw in the dark, things that shouldn't have been. In the summer of 1965, a group of explorers decided to venture into the mine, hoping to uncover the secrets of Eska. They were a mix of college students, historians, and local thrill-seekers. They didn't believe in curses, or ghosts, or anything supernatural. They thought the stories were just that, stories. But by the time they came running out of that mine, they understood that some stories are born of truth. I was one of them, though I didn't know it yet. I'd heard the whispers, the stories passed down from one generation to the next. But I was a skeptic, like the others. I thought the Curse of Eska was just a tale for telling around campfires, the kind of thing that gets scarier with every retelling. We set out on an unseasonably warm summer morning, a group of 5, eager to uncover the secrets hidden beneath the cold earth. The sun was high, the sky a pale blue, but as we drove closer to the mine, the temperature seemed to drop, not drastically, but enough to make you notice. By the time we reached the entrance, the land had turned barren, and the trees had become twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The mine was an old, rusted hulk of its former self. The entrance was just a gaping maw in the earth, the smell of damp stone and rotting wood hanging thick in the air. The sound of our boots crunching in the snow echoed like thunder in the silence. We went inside. First, there was nothing out of the ordinary. The walls were lined with old timber, some still solid, some rotting away. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and old earth. But there was a tension there, too, a feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching us from the dark corners of the tunnels. It was Laura, one of the historians, who first noticed the marks on the walls. They weren't normal. They weren't scratches from tools or the wear of time. No, these were something else entirely. Handprints, hands pressed deep into the stone, as though someone or something had tried to claw its way out of the earth itself. And they weren't new. These marks had been there for decades, fading but still visible, as if they were waiting for someone to see them. "What the hell is this?" Laura whispered, her voice trembling as she traced her fingers along the print. Her breath was shallow, the unease creeping into her voice. That's when we heard it. A sound, faint at first, but growing louder. A low moaning, like someone in pain, trapped in the depths. We all stopped, staring at each other, but no one moved. The air was thick with the smell of old coal. But beneath it, there was something else, something sour, like the scent of decay. And then, came again, a scream, piercing the silence. A sound so raw and guttural that it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was the kind of scream that no human could make. Not from fear, not from pain, but from something deeper, something primal. I turned to the others, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking, but none of them moved. They were frozen, their eyes wide with terror, staring at something deeper in the mine. I followed their gaze, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing in the shadows. It was a man, or something that resembled a man, but his features were distorted, warped by the darkness. His face was hollow, his eyes sunken, but what struck me most were his hands. His hands were covered in blood, and they reached out toward us, fingers twitching in the air. I could hear the sound of the chains before I saw them, heavy, rusted chains, dragging along the ground like the weight of the dead. And then, a voice. It wasn't the voice of the man, but 1,000 voices, crying out in unison, screaming, begging, calling us to join them in the dark. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Laura by the arm and pulling her back toward the exit. But we couldn't move fast enough. The walls seemed to stretch, to twist, as if the mine itself was alive, trapping us in its grip. The shadows closed in, and I could feel the coldness of the earth seeping into my bones. We didn't make it out. The next thing I knew, I was outside, gasping for breath, covered in dirt, my skin slick with sweat. I was the only one who made it. The others were gone, disappeared. Their faces were etched into my memory, their eyes wide with terror. But I couldn't remember their names. All I knew was the cold, the darkness, and the sound of chains dragging across the stone. The mine was sealed after that, the town deciding to finally bury the curse along with the bodies of the men who had died there. They say the spirits still linger in the dark, waiting for someone foolish enough to enter. But I know the truth. Some places don't die. They don't fade away. Alaskan mine is one of them. And the curse is real. I should have listened. I should have known better. But it's too late now. Story number 3. The shadow in the haunted mine. It was the kind of place where men go to die, whether they realize it or not. The old mining town of Deadwood Pass, tucked away in the rugged, snow-capped hills of Alaska, had a reputation. People didn't speak much about it. And when they did, it was only in hushed tones, like the name of a curse that shouldn't be uttered too loudly. Qmoqam, the haunted mine. Even the toughest of the tough avoided it. And those who didn't either didn't come back at all, or came back with stories that twisted their minds into something unrecognizable. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not then. I was a practical man, a miner by trade, one of those who saw the world through the lens of hard work and grit. There was no room for superstition when you lived off the sweat of your brow and the iron in your hands. But that was before I found myself at the entrance of that forsaken mine. Before I came face to face with the shadow that still haunts me. Even now, years later. It started when I got the job. I was down on my luck. The economy had tanked, and work had dried up in the lower 48. When I got the call from the foreman in Deadwood Pass, felt like a godsend. A few weeks of work in the wilderness, getting paid good money to haul or and dig in the earth. No one talked much about the mine's history. The foreman didn't mention the disappearances. People didn't say anything about the stories that had followed the place like a dark cloud for generations. They didn't need to. The past has a way of being buried under layers of dust and dirt, until it isn't anymore. I arrived on a cold winter morning, the wind howling like a living thing, carrying snowflakes that cut at the skin like glass. The mine's entrance was a gaping black hole in the side of the mountain, as though the earth itself had been torn open by something ancient and angry. The crew was already there, a mix of veterans and newcomers, men who had been through their own personal hells and found their way to this hell on earth. The foreman, a wiry man named Tom, welcomed me with a handshake that felt like cold iron. "Welcome to Deadwood Pass," he said, his voice gravelly. "You'll find the work is hard, but the pay is good. Just don't get lost in the tunnels. And don't go poking around places where you're not supposed to be." "Got it." I nodded, a little uneasy, but I chalked it up to first-day nerves. The mine was busy with activity, the air thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and stale air. Machines clanked and whirred in the background. But something about the place made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I noticed the way the older miners kept to themselves, eyes darting nervously when they thought no one was watching. It wasn't long before I heard my first story. It was a conversation overheard in the break room, a hushed discussion between two of the more seasoned men. "You ever hear about Bobby Jenkins?" one of them asked. "He was working on the east shaft last year. Said he felt something pulling on his clothes, like hands or fingers. Thought it was just the cold at first, but then it happened again and again, until one day, he just disappeared." "That's the thing with the east shaft," the other miner said, his voice low, like he was afraid to speak too loud. "People have been vanishing down there for years. No one knows why. But every so often, someone goes missing, never a trace, like they were sucked into the earth. I didn't buy it. I shook my head and laughed it off. This was just miners' talk. The kind of stories that get passed around like campfire tales. Ghosts and shadows in the dark. My job was simple: dig, haul, repeat. But as I headed down to the tunnels that afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The tunnels were cold and narrow, and the deeper we went, the darker it seemed. I worked alongside Ray, an older man with a permanent scowl on his face, his hands worn and rough from years of labor. We were assigned to the West Tunnel, but the East Tunnel, where the disappearances had happened, was close enough that I could feel the pull of it. I tried not to think about it, but the thought kept gnawing at me, like a rat nibbling at the back of my mind. A few hours in, I felt it. The first time it happened, I didn't know what to make of it. I was crouched down, scraping away at the rock with my pickaxe when I felt a tug at my shirt. Not a strong pull, just enough to make me stop and look around. I glanced over at Ray, but he was focused on his work. Oblivious. I shrugged it off. Maybe I'd caught my shirt on a rock or caught a draft. But then it happened again. A tug, like someone had grabbed the back of my shirt and yanked. This time, I stood up fast, spinning around, but there was nothing there. Ray noticed me. "You all right?" he asked, eyes narrowing with suspicion. Yeah. Just the cold," I muttered, trying to shake off the unease that was crawling up my spine. Must have caught my shirt on something. Ray didn't say anything, but I saw the look in his eyes. He had seen this before. I could tell. Later that night, when we were finishing up our shift, something changed. The temperature dropped suddenly, like the mine had swallowed all the warmth. We were at the edge of the East Tunnel, close enough that I could hear the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. That's when we heard it. A voice, not a shout, but a whisper, soft, faint, coming from the dark tunnel ahead. I froze, my heart thumping in my chest. I turned to Ray. He looked as though he had seen a ghost. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Ray nodded, his face pale. "I told you," he said quietly. "It's them. The ones who never came back." Before I could ask him what he meant, the voice came again, louder this time, and this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream, a man's scream, so high-pitched and desperate that it cut through the air like a blade. Ray grabbed my arm and yanked me back toward the main shaft, his grip tight with panic. "We gotta go. Now." We ran. But it was no use. The moment we hit the main shaft, we knew something was wrong. The tunnel seemed endless, stretching further and further into the dark. And the scream echoed around us, getting closer, closer, as though something was right behind us. I don't know how long we ran, but we finally made it back to the surface, gasping for air, our lungs burning with the cold. We collapsed in the snow, looking up at the sky, trying to shake the terror that gripped us. But there was no escape from what we had heard. Later, when we went back to the tunnel, Ray was gone. His helmet was lying on the ground, just like Bobby Jenkins had been. But Ray was nowhere to be found. The tunnel had swallowed him whole, just as it had swallowed so many before him. No trace, no sign, only the echo of his scream, lingering in the air. I left Deadwood Pass the next morning, my skin crawling with the memory of that dark tunnel. But sometimes, even now, in the stillness of the night, I hear it, that scream, that whisper, the shadow in the mind that never leaves. Calls to me, calls to everyone, and one day, it will call to you, too. Story number 4. The mine and the screams in the snowstorm. I've never been the type to believe in ghosts or the supernatural. At least, I didn't used to be, but that was before the winter of '78. Before I found myself standing at the mouth of an old mine shaft, listening to the screams that echoed from deep inside the earth, carried on the howling winds of a snowstorm. Before I saw the drawings, the walls telling a story no one was alive to finish. It all started with a job. The kind of job you take when you're desperate. When you're down to your last dime and the only thing that promises even a scrap of security is the bitter cold of the north. I'd been working at the old mine near the Arctic Circle for months. Just like the rest of the crew, we were trying to make a living in the middle of nowhere, digging for minerals and keeping the lights on. Some of the men were rougher than others, hardened by years of labor. They didn't mind the cold. Hell, some of them thrived in it. But me, I'd always dreamed of getting away from this kind of life. Yet there I was, stuck in the icy belly of the north, where the sun barely rises in the winter months. It was a place where the world seemed to disappear into a sheet of white, endless snow. Endless cold. The mine was old. Older than anyone cared to remember. It had been abandoned once, decades ago, after a cave-in killed a dozen men. The company had tried to restart operations. But no one wanted to work there anymore. Too many accidents. Too many unexplained things. But eventually, a few of us came along, and we were desperate enough to ignore the stories. It was late December when the storm hit. A blizzard like nothing I'd seen before. The wind roared through the old mining town, rattling the windows and shaking the very bones of the buildings. Most of the crew was holed up inside, trying to stay warm. But not all of us. Some of us had to work. Even in that madness, we'd been instructed to check the ventilation shafts, clear away any snow that might be blocking the air supply. And that's when it started. I was with a man named Ray. Ray was an old hand at this kind of work. Didn't talk much. Always had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. We trudged through the snow, our boots sinking into the thick drifts, as the wind sliced at our skin. As we made our way toward the mine entrance, I thought I heard something. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable over the storm's fury. But then it came again, louder this time. A scream. It wasn't just a scream. It was a cry for help, for someone trapped, someone in pain. "Did you hear that?" I asked, looking over at Ray. He stopped in his tracks and cocked his head to the side, his eyes narrowing. "Yeah," he muttered. "Sounds like it's coming from inside the mine." We exchanged glances. It didn't make sense. The mine had been abandoned for years. No one had worked in that section of the shaft in ages. But the scream came again. Unmistakable. A man's voice, weak and desperate. "Should we check it out?" I asked, feeling a sense of unease creeping over me. Ray didn't hesitate. "I'll go first," he said, taking a deep drag from his cigarette before flicking it into the snow. The wind howled louder as we approached the mine entrance. A dark maw in the snow. There was no one around. No footprints leading inside. Just the ominous presence of the storm and the distant scream, still echoing in our ears. We entered the mine, and the cold hit us like a fist. The walls of the tunnel were damp and smelled of earth and old rust. It was pitch black. But Ray had his flashlight. He led the way, each step echoing in the narrow shaft. The scream came again, louder this time, as if it was right behind us. I could feel my pulse quicken. We hurried forward, Ray shining the light on the walls as we moved deeper into the mine. That's when we saw it. On the wall of the tunnel, carved into the stone, was a drawing. It was crude, done with what looked like charcoal or some kind of thick, dark pigment. The image depicted a man, his face twisted in fear, his arms raised as if to ward off something. Around him were shadows, swirling black forms that seemed to stretch and coil like living things, encroaching on him, suffocating him. The man's mouth was open, but his scream was silent. The figures around him were painted in darker strokes, their eyes glowing with a malevolent red hue. I froze, staring at the image. There was something horribly familiar about it. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. But Ray didn't seem to care. He was already moving forward, his light flickering across the next section of the tunnel. "Hey, hold up," I shouted. But Ray didn't turn around. He kept walking, oblivious, as if the picture didn't bother him at all. I wanted to follow, but something inside me told me not to. That scream again. closer now, flooded my mind. There was no one here, no one alive. At least, we were alone. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard a soft scraping sound behind me. It was faint, like nails on stone, but it was there, unmistakable. I whirled around. No one. Then the scream came again, louder than ever, echoing through the mine like a banshee's wail. I bolted forward, heading toward the exit, heart pounding. But I wasn't sure if Ray was still ahead of me. I couldn't see him anymore. I was almost out when I heard something strange. Something so bizarre that I almost didn't want to believe it. The sound of footsteps behind me. Heavy. Purposeful. Someone was walking toward me. No, something was walking toward me. I turned and shone my flashlight toward the sound. The beam flickered once, twice, and then froze. There, in the distance, standing at the entrance of the tunnel, was a figure, a man, or something that looked like a man. His eyes glowed red in the light, like the shadows in the drawing. His face was gaunt, hollow, and twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. The scream, it had come from him. The man, or whatever it was, stared at me, and for a moment, I thought he would speak. But then he didn't. Instead, his mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, and his lips cracked like old stone. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I don't know how I made it out of that mine, but I did. I was outside before I realized what had happened. The storm had let up. The wind had died down, and the silence was deafening. But Ray didn't come out. I don't know what happened to him, but I can guess. I can feel it in my bones. The mine had taken him, just like it had taken those before him. The screams I heard, they weren't from any living man. When we finally went back to search for Ray, the mine was empty. The walls were bare. No more drawings. No more footprints. The only thing left was a faint echo in the wind. The scream that never stopped. Story number 5. The Vanishing Miner of Nome. Nome, Alaska, is one of those places where the snow falls heavier than anywhere else, and the wind cuts through the streets like a blade, leaving no room for warmth or comfort. It's a place that has seen too much hardship, too much loss. The kind of town where you learn not to ask questions about the past, especially the kind of questions that can make your skin crawl or chill you to your bones. It's a town that has seen gold, riches, and death, and somewhere between those two things, the truth gets buried. And for some, it stays buried forever. I came to Nome to get away from everything: life, work, a failed marriage, an unraveled career. I needed the cold, the isolation, and that's how I ended up in the heart of Nome stories, lost in a legend that had haunted this town since 1930. Jack Larkin was a name you'd hear now and then, mostly whispered over drinks at the local bar or muttered under the breath of old-timers who had long since learned to stop asking questions about things better left untouched. But once I heard his story, once I dug deeper, I knew that I'd never be able to let it go. Jack Larkin wasn't just another prospector. He was the type who would disappear into the wilderness with nothing but a pickaxe, a rifle, and a stubborn streak that ran deep. He came to Nome in the late 1920s, part of the gold rush that brought men like him to the wild Alaskan frontier. He wasn't looking for fame or fortune. He was looking for something else, something even he couldn't put into words. Maybe he was running from something. Maybe he just wanted to prove he could survive in the most unforgiving land on earth. But whatever it was a dream that consumed him. Jack would disappear for days, sometimes weeks, on end, coming back to town with stories of striking it rich, of veins of gold hidden in the most remote corners of the frozen wilderness. But then, on one cold February day in 1930, he went out and never came back. The search began quickly enough. The snow had already begun to fall thick by the time the first group of men headed into the mountains. Guided by the few clues Jack had left behind, they found his camp. It was a simple setup, nothing extravagant, just a fire pit, his tools, and a heavy coat tossed aside as though he'd been in a hurry. But there was no sign of Jack himself. No footprints leading anywhere. And that's when the first mystery hit them. On the edge of the camp, they found one of Jack's boots. It was half buried in the snow, as if he had taken it off and left it behind. But the other boot, nowhere to be found. As the days wore on, the search grew more desperate, more frantic. They found more of his things scattered across the landscape, his tools, his rifle, a few supplies, but no sign of Jack. And yet, what unnerved them the most was what they couldn't find. His tracks. No footprints in the snow, no trail to follow, just an eerie blank space where a man had once walked, as if he had been swallowed whole by the wilderness. It was on the fourth day of the search that one of the men found something that froze the blood in his veins. Half buried in the snow, near a thick cluster of trees, was another one of Jack's boots. This one was different, though. It was soaked in blood, not just a trickle, but enough to turn the snow crimson. But there were no signs of a struggle, no signs of anything but the faintest of footprints, almost as if Jack had been dragged away. The men combed the area for days, but the trail went cold. It wasn't until much later that the rumors began to circulate. Whispers in the bar, behind closed doors. Some said Jack had gone mad, had heard something out there in the wilderness that drove him to madness. Others said he'd found something he wasn't meant to find, and that it had taken him. The official story, of course, was that Jack had simply wandered off and succumbed to the elements. But no one believed that, not in Nome, not with the way the snow covered his tracks, as though the earth itself was trying to swallow him whole. And so, the place where Jack had disappeared, the place he had last been seen, became known as the Forbidden Zone. No one talked about it. No one went there. The wilderness outside Nome became an unspoken thing, an area off-limits to anyone who had heard the stories. The wind howled through the trees in those parts, colder than anywhere else, and the darkness of the night seemed to stretch longer there. People said the air felt different, thicker, like something was watching. It didn't take long for other strange occurrences to follow. People reported hearing strange noises in the night, the crunch of footsteps in the snow, the sound of something or someone moving just out of sight. Some folks said they'd seen shadows flitting in and out of the trees at the edge of town. And then there were the dreams. Those who had dared to venture into the Forbidden Zone would come back with stories of dreams filled with dark, twisted figures, pale faces staring from the trees, whispering things that no one could understand. I heard all these stories, of course, but I wasn't like the others. I didn't believe in ghosts or things that went bump in the night. I wasn't afraid of some old man's disappearance. I thought it was just superstition, just stories people told to make the long winters seem less endless. But that was before I went out to find Jack. I'd heard enough to know that something was wrong in that place. The first time I went into the Forbidden Zone, I didn't know what to expect. The wind was biting cold, biting through my coat, but I wasn't worried about the cold. I had come to find answers, and nothing would stop me. I made my way deep into the woods, following the faintest trail of snow, just a hint of something unnatural in the otherwise perfect landscape. The further I walked, the heavier the air became. It was as if the earth itself had become thick with secrets, holding its breath. And then I heard it, a sound distant at first, barely audible, like something scraping against stone. A faint tapping sound, growing louder with each step I took. I tried to dismiss it, but it only grew more insistent. The noise seemed to be coming from beneath me, from deep within the earth itself. I knelt down, my breath visible in the cold air, and pressed my ear to the ground. The noise was unmistakable now. It was like something was digging, scraping, clawing its way through the earth, trying to break free. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, from somewhere deep in the forest, I heard a voice. Jack. It whispered, just above the sound of the wind. It was a voice I didn't recognize, but it sounded familiar. It sounded like, Jack. I bolted back to town, the images of those pale faces and that scraping noise flashing through my mind. That night, I didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. Something had happened in those woods. Something had taken Jack. And whatever it wasn't finished. I never went back to that place. No one does. But the stories linger. And somewhere out there, in the deep Alaskan wilderness, there's a place where the earth is quiet, and where the wind carries whispers of a man who disappeared without a trace, swallowed whole by something no one can explain. The Forbidden Zone has a way of holding on to its secrets, and it doesn't let you go until it's ready. Story number 6. The Ghosts of Treadwell Mine. I first heard about Treadwell Mine from a friend. Not just any friend, mind you, but a seasoned ghost hunter who had spent years chasing shadows and whispers across the most haunted corners of the United States. He spoke of it one evening, after a bottle of whiskey and a long day's work, his voice low and gravelly, like he was trying to keep the truth from slipping out too quickly. "Treadwell," he said, his eyes narrowing as if he were remembering something too dark to name. "There's something about that place. Something that doesn't like to be remembered." I didn't believe him at first. I mean, who would? Ghosts in a mine? It sounded like a page out of some pulp horror novel. Nothing more. But the more he talked, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something real behind his words. Something that had been buried, forgotten, until the wrong person came along and uncovered it. Treadwell wasn't just any old mine. It was infamous. A symbol of greed and destruction. A relic of the early 20th century gold rush. Located near Juneau, Alaska, it had been the scene of one of the deadliest mining disasters in the state's history. In 1917, a catastrophic collapse in one of the shafts killed dozens of men, burying them beneath tons of rock and rubble. Most of the bodies were never recovered, and the mine was closed for good, leaving behind nothing but the wreckage of the past. But the legend of Treadwell didn't die with the last man who had worked there. By the time I made my way to Juneau in the winter of 1978, Treadwell had already become little more than a forgotten piece of history. The mine was still there, of course, but it had been abandoned for decades. The buildings were decrepit, their walls sagging with the weight of time and neglect. The ground around the mine was littered with rusted tools, half-buried tracks, and remnants of the once thriving operation. To most, it was just another ghost town. But to those who knew its history, it was a place where the dead didn't stay dead. The first time I went to Treadwell, I wasn't expecting much. A long hike into the frozen hills, a little poking around in the abandoned buildings, maybe a few strange noises here and there, nothing out of the ordinary. I brought along a camera, some equipment, and an open mind, fully prepared to leave with a few photos of dilapidated buildings and a good story to tell. But that's not what happened. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the valley. The air was bitter cold, the kind of cold that sank deep into your bones. The only sounds were the occasional creak of old wood and the wind whistling through the trees. I wandered through the mine's crumbling buildings, snapping photos of old machinery, rusted rails, and forgotten tools. It was eerie, yes, but not more so than any other abandoned place I'd visited. Still, there was something unsettling about it. The way the air felt too still, the way the silence seemed too heavy, like the place was holding its breath. It wasn't until I stepped into one of the old storage sheds that I first heard it. A faint noise, barely perceptible at first, but unmistakable once I stopped moving. It was the sound of metal striking metal like a pickaxe hitting rock. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, straining my ears. The sound came again, this time clearer, louder. Someone was working, but there was no one around. I walked cautiously toward the noise, my boots crunching in the snow, my flashlight flickering in the gloom. As I rounded the corner of the shed, the sound abruptly stopped, leaving only silence in its wake. I held my breath, feeling a chill settle into my chest. Nothing. No one. It was then that I noticed the doors. The shed's double doors were partially open, but the hinges were rusted. There was no way they should have moved on their own. And yet, the doors were swaying slightly, as if someone had just pushed them. I swallowed hard, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. It didn't make sense. The wind wasn't strong enough to move them. There were no signs of human presence. No footprints in the snow. Nothing to suggest that anyone had been here in a long time. But the doors moved again, creaking on their hinges, and I stepped back, my flashlight flickering again. This time, I didn't wait for it to flicker back on. I turned and ran. That was my first night at Treadwell. The night I heard the whispers. The second time, I brought a team with me, 3 other people who, like me, had heard the rumors. And this time, we weren't just there to take pictures. We came with equipment, sound recorders, EMF detectors, infrared cameras, anything that might help us capture something, anything that could explain what I had experienced. The first few hours were uneventful. We set up camp inside one of the old cabins, unpacking our gear and preparing for the night ahead. The wind howled outside, but inside, it was strangely calm. Too calm. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on us from above. We spent the next few hours taking readings, recording the faintest of sounds. But nothing happened. No whispers, no strange lights. By midnight, we were all starting to feel the tension that came with being in such a place. The unease that hung in the air, like the weight of the mine's tragic past. Then it started. It began with the sounds of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, echoing through the old mine shafts. We looked at each other, confused, but none of us had the courage to move. We followed the noise, our footsteps crunching in the snow, our breath coming out in visible puffs of cold air. And then we saw it, a figure, barely visible in the darkness, walking slowly through the abandoned mine. It was tall, hunched over slightly, wearing an old mining helmet with a flickering light. His clothes were torn and stained, as though they had been worn for years, their edges frayed and weathered. We called out, but the figure didn't respond. It simply walked on, as though it hadn't heard us. We followed it, cautiously, but when we turned the corner of the shaft, it was gone, just gone. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rusted metal, but the figure had disappeared, as though it had never been there at all. I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe just a hallucination brought on by fatigue. But that's not what it was. Over the next few days, we heard more sounds, pickaxes hitting stone, the shuffle of boots on gravel, the whisper of voices in the dark. We saw more figures, shadows in the corners of our vision, flickering in and out of existence. The thing that bothered me the most, though, was the feeling that came with it. The feeling that we weren't supposed to be there, like we were trespassing, not just on land, but on something far worse, something ancient, something that had been disturbed and now wanted us to leave. And yet, even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that I didn't hear everything, that the mine is still speaking, still calling out in the dark, waiting for the next person to listen. Because I know one thing for sure, Treadwell's ghosts, they don't just haunt the past. They're waiting for the future, too. Story number 7. The Whispers of Kennecott. There are places in this world that feel wrong. Not just a bad feeling, but a deep, primal sense that something is terribly, terribly off. That's how Kennecott was for me. The old mining town nestled in the heart of Alaska, abandoned now, but still clinging to the past with its rusted walls and decaying structures. I didn't come here for the history, and I certainly didn't come for the stories. But sometimes, when you step into the wrong place, the stories come to you, whether you want them to or not. It was 1974 when I first found myself at Kennecott. I was just a kid, really, 22 years old, fresh out of college, and desperate for adventure. The world felt big, but that winter, the world felt smaller and smaller with every step I took away from home. The past had a way of creeping up on you, though, especially in places like Kennecott, and I didn't know it then, but I was about to learn exactly how much the past could haunt you. I came to work with a small group of surveyors, tasked with exploring the area around the old mine, and I was eager to get started. I'd heard the rumors. Of course, who hadn't? The stories about miners disappearing. Strange sounds echoing from the tunnels. Whispers in the wind that made you feel like someone was watching. Even when you were all alone. But like any young man, I was skeptical. I wasn't the kind to put stock in ghost stories. At least, I didn't think I was. I believed in hard work. The kind that came from the earth and the sweat on your brow. Ghosts? I didn't have time for that. The town of Kennecott was empty, except for a few people who lived in nearby homes. The old mining equipment was rusted and abandoned, and the long, dark tunnels that snaked deep into the mountains seemed to stretch on forever. I was told the mines had been shut down years ago, after a series of accidents and cave-ins. Some said it was bad luck. Others whispered that it was something darker. The place had been cursed, they said. A place where the dead wouldn't stay dead. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. The days were filled with long hours, surveying the land, marking the old shafts, and checking the stability of the mines. But at night, that's when the real feeling started to set in. There were no lights in Kennecott, not the kind that could drown out the darkness. Anyway, it was the kind of silence that ate at you, like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to break the stillness. I remember the first time I heard it. It was just before midnight, and I was standing in the middle of the old storage yard, looking up at the skeletal remains of the mill. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that cuts to the bone, and the sky above was filled with stars, so clear they seemed close enough to touch. It was the kind of night that made you feel small, alone. That's when I heard it, just a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the words were clear enough. My name, Jacob. I froze, my heart lurching in my chest. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was no one. The yard was empty, no movement, not even the sound of a bird. The silence was suffocating. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But that voice, it was too real, too close. I shook my head, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I'd heard the rumors about Kennecott, but I hadn't thought they'd get to me. I wasn't some gullible fool who believed in ghost stories. I wasn't. But over the next few days, I heard it again and again, the whispers in the wind, soft and insistent, and each time, they called my name. I asked the others about it, the team I was working with. There was Derek, the old hand who had been in the field for years, and Doug, a quiet, bookish guy who seemed to keep to himself. Neither of them admitted to hearing anything, but there was something in their eyes that made me uneasy, a look that said they knew more than they were letting on. It wasn't until we ventured deeper into the mines that things truly started to unravel. We were checking one of the older shafts that had been closed off years ago. It was pitch black inside, and the air felt thick, as though it had been sealed away for too long. I remember stepping into the mine with my flashlight in hand, the beam slicing through the darkness, illuminating walls that had been untouched for decades. We hadn't been down there for more than an hour when we heard it. The sound of something shifting in the dark, something moving. I told Derek to go first, and he led the way, cursing under his breath as he knocked into old equipment left behind by the miners. It was then that Doug, who had been trailing behind us, stopped. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I turned, but Doug wasn't looking at me. He was looking down the shaft, his face pale. There was something about the way he looked, something I couldn't place. It wasn't fear. It was something else, something worse. "I didn't hear anything," I said, but the words sounded hollow. Even to me, the silence that followed was thick, too thick. And then, a soft voice, low, guttural, echoed from the darkness. "Jacob." It wasn't the wind this time. It wasn't my imagination. It was clear. I could feel the breath on my neck, cold and damp. And when I turned, I saw something in the dark, a shadow, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It wasn't human, not exactly. It was too tall, too thin, like it had been stretched. its limbs unnaturally long. We ran, blindly, out of the shaft, back into the open air. But when we reached the entrance, we saw something that stopped us in our tracks. The ground had shifted, as though something heavy had passed through the earth. The entrance to the mine was blocked, a mass of rubble that hadn't been there before. We couldn't get back in, and as we stood there, catching our breath, I heard it again, the voice. Jacob! I never heard it from the others, but I could see it in their eyes. They had heard the whispers too. It wasn't until later, after we left Kennecott, that I learned the truth about the mine. The cave-in that had killed so many miners was no accident. It was no random act of fate. Some said the ground had been cursed, that the souls of the dead still haunted the tunnels, waiting for revenge. Others said the miners had done something unforgivable, something dark that had called forth the spirits. I don't know which story is true, but I know this: I'll never forget the whispers. It's been years now. I moved on. I built a life. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, when the air feels heavy, I hear it, that voice, calling me, and I know, deep down, that it's not over. The whispers of Kennecott, they never leave. They wait. They always wait.